Hello, my name is Eva Jablonka, and I'm a retired professor from Tel Aviv University. My talk is part of the symposium on animal consciousness in comparison to human consciousness in the Cognitive Sciences Society 2021 in Vienna. I'm very happy to be here. I start with thanks to my colleagues, first and foremost to Simona Ginsburg, with whom most of the ideas that I'm presenting here were developed, and to Anna Zeligovsky for the pictures, and for my student and my colleagues, especially my ex-student, Zohar Bronfman. I'm starting with the assumption that consciousness has evolved. I'm not going to justify this assumption, but I'm going to start with it. And I'm going to say it happened at some point during the evolution of life. Here is a quotation from Björn Merker. Somewhere between Medusa and human, there is a transition to conscious function, and the nature of the capacity it bestows has exercised psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive studies virtually since their inception. And when I'm talking about consciousness, what I mean here is the kind of subjective experiencing that we have, the perception of the red poppy, the smelling, actually having the subjective experience of smelling a jasmine, the feel of pain, the joy of seeing a friend, nausea, the feeling of the body when we are dancing. This is what we mean. And when one does have this kind of subjective experiencing, it feels like something to be a being with this kind of experiences. Now, so as I said, I assume that consciousness evolved, and I'm not going to justify this assumption. I'm going to use, therefore, to use an evolutionary approach to study consciousness. And the approach that I'm using is to study the transition from non-conscious to conscious mode of being. And when I'm thinking about it, when Simona and I think about it, we are looking for something that we call an evolutionary marker of the transition to consciousness, because consciousness is a very elusive and evasive concept. We are basing our analysis on a methodology developed by Tibor Ganti, a Hungarian theoretical chemist, and the evolutionary biologist Mina Smith and Ersat Murray. They used it when they were studying the origin of life and also the origin of other transitions in evolution. I will then discuss some of the effects of this transition to minimal consciousness, the simplest possible consciousness, as I go along. So we are looking at a property that we call an evolutionary transition marker. And this property is such that when we find evidence of it, we have evidence that the major evolutionary transition in which we are interested has gone to completion. And moreover, the transition marker, when we identify it, allows us to reverse engineer the system that enables it. So let me explain it in a little bit more detail. Here we have the kind of general scheme. We start with a list of capacities that if we find that we think that, and that most researchers think, characterize consciousness. Such a list includes all kinds of capacities, and this capacity, if we find them jointly in an organism, in some kind of entity on another planet, most people would say, well, this probably is a conscious kind of entity. So we start with a list of capacities about which there is more or less a consensus. And we say this list of capacities, if all of them exist, is sufficient for identifying a creature with a certain mode of being. This mode of being can be living, it can be consciousness, it can be rationality. And then we say, well, we want now to look for one kind of capacity, one capacity that when we have it, it requires that the whole list is in place. The reason we want one such capacity, this is the transition marker, is that it will be much easier to follow it during evolution. So the capacity, the transition marker, requires that the list of capacities is in place. And when you have the list of capacities, this is sufficient for characterizing a particular mode of being. So the transition marker marks the presence of a mode of being, in this case, of consciousness. Now, what is the list? Let us start with it. What is the consensus list? Again, this list is based on a very, very large number of studies from cognitive sciences, from neurobiology, from philosophy of mind, from psychology, and so on. And this is the list that Simona and I, are suggesting. So we need to have something like binding and unification, with this apple both as green as in round. We need something like global accessibility and broadcast, so that we form beliefs, generalization, memories about our perceptions and our feelings. We need to have some form of selective attention. So there must be some kind of attention mechanisms and exclusion mechanisms. We have to be able to focus attention, to select the object of attention, to sustain attention, to shift attention, and so on. We need something that is called intentionality, aboutness, that is mappings of the body, of the world, and of prospective action, mapping within the brain. We need the subjective experience is felt, has a duration. So we need there to be integration through time. We need working memory, what James called the species present. We need a flexible evaluative systems that allows prioritization according to context. We need agency, proactivity. The conscious organisms are not just reactive, they are proactive. We need embodiment, and not every kind of embodiment probably would do for biological conscious being. We need object-oriented spatial cognition, requiring many degrees of freedom of movement. We need a registration of self and other and a stable perspective from which one experiences the world and oneself and one's action, also a sense of body ownership, a kind of what Merker called an ego center. So this is a list that if we found an entity on some other planet that has all these properties, we would try not to hurt its feelings. We would assume that it is conscious. Now, we were looking for a long time for a transition marker that when it is present, all this list exists. And in the end, we suggested that the transition marker is a form of complex associative learning, which we call unlimited associative learning, which requires that an animal can distinguish and discriminate among novel compound patterns of stimuli and action. So you see two things which are made up of the same components, but with slightly different organization, and you can distinguish between them. You can actually see that they are different. The organization is different, although the components may be exactly the same. So this is one characterization of this kind of unlimited associative learning. Another characterization is that there is second order learning. So you learn something of this type, and then you can build on this and learn another thing on the basis of what you have already learned. So this can allow the organism to build chains of associative links. The organism must also be able to learn, even if there is a time gap between a neutral complex stimulus and some kind of reinforcement. So even if something that you have to learn that predicts a reinforcement is present and doesn't overlap in time with the reinforcement, you can nevertheless learn it. So you need something like working memory here. The fourth requirement is that the value of a learned pattern can be flexibly changed. So something that was rewarding in condition A can be punishing in condition B. And the other thing that one can do is that you can prioritize different things in a flexible way. We all the time get a lot of inputs that we have to evaluate and we have to prioritize. And this is a very important part also, and we have to learn to prioritize in the right way. So these are the characteristics of the evolutionary marker. Now this is here is an example of such an evolutionary marker, spatial learning. It needs multimodal integration, it needs agency, it's decision-making, complex decision-making, and very flexible ability to change your mind about what is dangerous and when it is dangerous and so on, because the environment, of course, changes. So here we see the list of capacities. We say that the unlimited associative learning actually requires all these capacities. For example, unification and differentiation are needed to construct a compound stimulus. Global accessibility is needed to enable integration of information from multiple systems and to form generalizations about them and categorize them. we need exclusion and amplification in order to know on what to focus and not to focus. We need a flexible evaluative system, and so on. So we can show that actually unlimited associative learning requires that all this list is in place. And this list, we argue, is sufficient for a good characterization of an experiencing system. Now, in order for unlimited associative learning to exist, we need to have mechanisms that integrate various underlying sensory signals and form compound percepts. And the encoding must be recurrent, multi-stage, and hierarchical in order to actually weld in a finite world. The interaction must generate a body model, a world model, and a model of prospective action. And there needs to be a reliable model of the interaction among all these models, so a model of models. We need to have mechanisms of exclusion of irrelevant signals and focusing mechanism. We need to have a dedicated memory system that enables subsequent retrieval based on learned compound patterns, not only the local synaptic memory between two neurons, but some kind of system that actually enables us to remember compounds. And the evaluation system must be able to assign valence to any compound input and prioritize active programs. So here is a very minimal kind of UAL architecture. I will not go into details, but what we see here are the 5 major components that we are focusing on. The sensory integrating system in blue, the motor integrating system where we map prospective action in yellow, the reinforcement system that maps all the inputs that come from the body and evaluates them, that gives them salience. There is a memory system that is integrative, and all these things converge on a central kind of unit, which is a kind of akin to the minimal global workspace at the core of the network. But of course, there is no commitment to anything like the workspace that we see in mammals or in humans. So UAL is a system property. It requires that there is a particular organized cluster of specifically interrelated capacities. And what is very interesting that in humans, and now also in some animals, for example, monkeys, they can manifest UAL, unlimited associative learning, only when they are consciously aware of the learned complex stimuli. When compound stimuli are masked, for example, no learning occurs. You cannot learn about compound masked objects or make complex decisions or learn by trace conditioning. That there is no learning in these conditions, although simpler forms of learning can occur unconsciously. But this kind of learning requires consciousness from reporting humans, and we can do equivalents of reporting in other animals. So, since UAL requires the characteristics of minimal consciousness in living organisms, and since it seems that this form of learning requires consciousness, UAL is a promising evolutionary marker of minimal consciousness. It doesn't have to be very complex. All the properties of the unlimited associative learning are found, as we shall see, in many animals. So, which animal groups actually show UAL? So there are 3 groups: the mollusks, the arthropods, and the vertebrates. Most vertebrates, many arthropods, and a particular group of mollusks, the cephalopods, the coleoid cephalopods, that include the octopus, the squid, and the cuttlefish. And here they are. And they can actually implement UAL, unlimited associative learning. And all these groups show the brain architecture that supports integration, hierarchical recurrent mapping of their world, an ability to distinguish between body-generated and world-generated stimuli, exclusion of irrelevant signals and focusing mechanism, dedicated memory system, and an evaluation system that assigns valence to any compound input configuration and enables context-sensitive prioritization. They have the functional architecture that implements this, although they are very, very different in structure, in arthropods, in vertebrates, and in cephalopods. And two of this group, the vertebrates and the arthropods, first appeared during the Cambrian, and from the fossil record, we know that their brains already had the structures that support UAL. So UAL, and if you accept that UAL is a good marker of consciousness, so consciousness first appeared during the Cambrian for 542 million years ago, during the Great Cambrian explosion when most of the body forms in the animal world first appeared. In the cephalopods, consciousness appeared 250 million years ago when they evolved. So consciousness had at least two origins, possibly three. Now, the effect, what were the effects? So we talked about the origins until now. What are the effects of UAL? The effects of UAL is not only appeared in the Cambrian, but Simona Ginsburg and I argued it was also the adaptability driver of the Cambrian explosion. It led to both antagonistic and cooperative arm races and feedbacks, and it was one of the engines, we argued, of the Cambrian explosion. So it allowed a huge number of new behaviors driven by this kind of learning, and they were accompanied by an explosion of new matching morphological adaptations. And they also led to the appearance and further sophistication of sense organs. It also led to further evolution of long-term memory, of integrating mechanisms, of hierarchical levels of predictive coding and top-down control, of flexible value systems, and eventually also later to the evolution of imaginative animals. And also possibly also to a particular mode of development and stable body morphology that can be reliably modeled by the brain. Now, however, there's also a price for learning, and one of them is, of course, suffering. And one of the sources of suffering is overlearning, and this is the smoke detector principles. So since many predators and competitors often pose immediate existential threats, associative learning inevitably leads to overreaction because the animal responds to cues that are sometimes, yet not always, associated with danger. And overreaction is advantageous as long as the benefits of avoiding actual danger exceed the cost of responding erroneously to perceived danger, which will often be the case with, for example, flight reaction, with preparing to fight an adversary, and with focusing attention on sources of potential harm. So flight response and a readiness to fight often occur when neither predator nor foe are around. And as a result of this, also, there is a lot of stress and a lot of suffering. So as a result of this overlearning, there'll be selection for genes involved in learning and in forgetting. It will be very important to forget. If you don't forget, you will suffer a lot. Selection for mechanism, and there will be also selection for mechanism ameliorating learning-induced stress. Here we have an example of what it was probably like for the poor fish who live in the Cambrian before all this ameliorating mechanisms evolved. The Cambrian probably witnessed the first nervous breakdowns. Now, there are also other effects on complex sensory patterns. For example, the patterns that we see in the world that are discriminated by animals wouldn't exist if this discrimination ability was not in place. So, for example, the complex pattern of the male fish body would evolve only if female could discriminate among variant patterns and assign value to them. Here it is. The evolution of the visual and olfactory patterns of flowers depend on the ability of insects and birds to discriminate among visual and olfactory patterns. So here, the ability of insects to discriminate is leading to the patterns, the beautiful patterns that we see on flowers. It's very interesting that wind-pollinated flowers are usually have no colors and have no smells. And so they're very, very boring from our point of view. And also another example that I can give, a nice example, is the construction of bowerbirds evolved because females can perceive and evaluate them. So here we are. Here is the female, the brown little female, looking critically at the bower constructed by the male. And also complex camouflage patterns would not evolve if there were no animals that could distinguish them from the background. the evolution of camouflage was driven by the discrimination ability of animals. So the beauty that we see in our world is one of the effects of consciousness. There are many, many things we can say both about the origin and the effects of consciousness, but I think that this picture is giving you some kind of feeling as to the kind of theory that we have developed. Thank you very much.